Hello and welcome to today's training on accessibility standards and legislation. In today's training, we will be providing you a brief history of accessibility legislation and diving into specific standards that relate to online accessibility. To get started, my name is Danae Cowell. I'm the online accessibility professional at the Graduate School and Stout Online. My email is listed out for you. That's cowelld@uwstout.edu. If you'd like to contact me after watching this presentation, I'd be happy to answer any questions or comment on any thoughts that you have. Okay, so on this slide, I've kind of laid out a timeline of the different events in history that have impacted accessibility related legislation, as well as the different acts that actually have been created. So you can see my first bullet point is 1950, and this is really where the idea of barrier-free design started to pop up and become popular, and was also accompanied by moving those with disabilities from institutionalized settings back into the community. Then I've got 1964 listed out, and that's when the Civil Rights Act occurred. And this was one of the first times that design was considered as part of civil rights or equality. And this sparked the interest in improving access and opportunities for people with disabilities and fueled the disability rights movement. Then in 1973, there was the Rehabilitation Act. And in the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504 was included, and this section mandated accommodations be made for people with disabilities. Then in 1975, there was the Education for Handicapped Children Act, which is now called IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Act, and this guarantees a free and appropriate education for children with disabilities, so focusing on K-12. Then in 1988, there was the Fair Housing Act that was amended, and in this amendment, it added in specific anti-discrimination requirements for private housing opportunities and promoted the design of accessible housing for people with disabilities. Then in 1989, the Center for Accessible Housing opened, and this was done by Ronald Mace, who is considered the pioneer of universal design. Today, that is now called the Center for Universal Design. Then in 1990, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act that was set into place, and this looked at both public and private entities and prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in a wide variety of areas. Then in 1996, we had the Telecommunications Act. And in this act, it mandates that telecommunication equipment and services be designed, developed, and fabricated to be accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. Then in 1998, the Rehabilitation Act was amended. And in this amendment, it added in technical requirements relating to web information, telecommunication functions, video or multimedia products, and then self-contained closed products. Then in 2010, we had the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, which further enforced accessible videos. And lastly, we have 2018 listed, and this is when Section 508 was refreshed, so it was updated again, and it is now mandating that we provide web accessibility or online accessibility that meets the international standards. So Section 508 is now aligned with the international accessibility standards. Okay, so obviously, as I mentioned, Section 508 is now aligned to the international standards, and these are called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0, and they are grouped into 3 different levels, and level A is the most basic level, and then level 3 is the most advanced. And right now, to be meeting compliance, you would need to have at least a level AA conformance to the international standards or national standards now to meet our federal legislation. And these international standards are based upon key principles, and those key principles include that web information be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So Principle 1, perceivable. Web content is made available to the senses, sight, hearing, touch. So this is really getting at thinking about how people use their senses and how they take in information. And the following guidelines are going to relate to this principle. Guideline 1.1, text alternatives. This first guideline is asking us to add text alternatives for any non-text content, meaning images, buttons, form elements, image maps, things like that. This is often added as an alt tag, so a description that is provided in HTML, so behind the scenes, for screen readers. Or it can be provided as a longer written description for anything that is a complex image. So perhaps you write a paragraph describing a diagram on screen. Guideline 1.2, time-based media. This guideline starts to look at media and how to make videos and audio accessible. To do this, you'll want to provide transcripts for audio, captions for videos, and audio descriptions as needed. So if you're not familiar with audio descriptions, these are narrated tracks intended to describe what is going on screen to those that are blind or who have low vision. So they essentially describe the on-screen action that's not captured in the spoken words or in the captions for the video. Guideline 1.3, adaptable. Create content that can be presented in different ways without losing information or structure. So what this means is that no matter the styling or the design of your web page, you still want the information and structure to stay the same. So one of the first ways that you can help to ensure this is by providing a heading structure. So make sure you're letting your users know what your main topic is, your subtopic of a subtopic, and so on and so forth. So in HTML, we call these your headings 1 through 6. And again, that aligns with your main topic and from then on. And this just helps to create hierarchy and show the structure of information to assistive technologies. In addition, you'll also want to make sure that your tables designate headers. So whether you have column or row headers, you want to let your users know that. Another thing to think about is navigation. So navigation should be easy to use and logical. People shouldn't be digging around to find where they want to go. Lastly, make sure that instructions do not rely solely upon shape, size, sound, or visual location. So for example, I wouldn't just want to say that you have to just click on this round button. Instead, I would want to include something like click on the round button that says next at the bottom of the page. Guideline 1.4, distinguishable. This guideline helps to make sure that elements are distinguished from one another and that in particular, content between the foreground and background is differentiated. Some ways to implement this include making sure you're not color coding information, that there is a high enough contrast between the foreground and background elements, so it's easy to see your text and other features, as well as thinking about how someone navigates using a keyboard. So if they are using a keyboard solely to move from element to element on a page, you need to include some kind of visual indicator to show where they're at. Other things to think about is that you don't want any functionality to be lost when your content is resized. So if someone zooms in on your page, or maybe they're using a smaller screen like a cell phone, you still want all your content and your interaction to be available to them. So if you're familiar with web design, you're going to want to think about using responsive design of web pages. Lastly, another way to implement this is to make sure that users can decide if they want to hear audio. Give them those controls to be able to stop, play, mute, or adjust audio as they need to. Okay, moving on to our second principle, Principle 2, operable. Interface forms, controls, and navigation are operable. This means that all users can perform your website functions and can easily interact with different elements. Guideline 2.1, keyboard accessible. This guideline gets at needing to ensure that all web content can be accessed using just a keyboard alone. So this is really helpful for those that have mobility issues or who have low vision, who can't rely on the mouse to get where they need to go. In addition, another consideration is making sure that any specific shortcut keys you add to your web page are not conflicting with common browser or assistive technology shortcut keys. Guideline 2.2, Enough Time. This guideline gets at making sure that users have enough time to read and use content as needed. To do this, it is best to avoid time limits or to give options to turn off any time limits. In addition, you'll also want to give users control to stop, pause, or hide animated content, so anything that might blink, flicker, or move. Guideline 2.3, Seizures. Obviously, we want to avoid causing seizures in our users. So this means that you are going to need to avoid flashing content, or if you must include it, that you're making sure that any piece of content does not flash more than 3 times per second. Just research has shown that if something flashes more than 3 times per second, that can induce seizures in people that are prone to seizures. So being conscious of that. Guideline 2.4, Provide ways to help users navigate, find content, and determine where they are. So there are several ways to implement this with web content. One of the first ways to do this is you can include a skip navigation link. This can be used to skip to the main content of a page instead of having navigation menus read on each page they're at. So as you can imagine with a web page, take Stouts for example, we have that main navigation menu at the top, and when you go to a new page, it's still there. So someone using a screen reader, if they don't have that skip navigation link, has to hear all of those menu items over and over again, time after time. So just including that can make it easier for them and way less repetitive. Another way to ensure that you have better navigation for users is to provide that heading structure we talked about. So again, making sure you're designating your main topic, your subtopic of subtopic, and so on. And also making sure you use identified page regions and landmarks when using HTML and ARIA. For page titles, you're going to want to make sure they're informative, so pick something that's descriptive and provides a label for what's going on in the page. You're also going to want to make sure your navigation is logical, so it's easy to use and simple. People aren't digging, as we've mentioned before, to find information. And another thing you can do is provide links that have descriptive labels. So oftentimes when people add links, they like to use the URL, so the really long web address that you probably frequently see. However, these are not recommended. When you have that really long web address, that can be pretty overwhelming for people that are using screen readers, and it also doesn't provide any information on where that link is going. So using a descriptive label instead lets them know where the page is and doesn't cause that burnout from hearing so much information displayed at once. Okay, so then we're talking about offering multiple ways to access information. So this is saying people should have multiple means of getting where they want to go. So some examples are providing a table of contents as well as a site search on your page, or providing that main navigation menu and a table of contents and a site search as just some examples. Lastly, make sure you're enabling that keyboard focus. So if a person is navigating using the keyboard, they again can see where they're at because there's a visual indicator. Okay, Guideline 2.5, Input Modalities. This is really getting at offering options for functionality. One way to ensure this is to provide alternatives for multi-point or path-based gestures. So if you're on an app and they are having you swipe to activate something, you'd need to have an alternative, as not everyone may be able to swipe. Maybe they have limited mobility or for other reasons. In addition, you'll want to provide options to turn off functionality that can be triggered by movement. For example, if something is triggered by shaking your phone, there may be people that might accidentally shake their phone or just not want that. So it's best to disable this feature or have the option to disable this feature. Then lastly, alternative text labels should be the same as visually apparent text labels. So if you have a button that says submit, your alt text for that button, so behind the scene for screen readers, should not be something different. You don't want to confuse people. So for example, if you have someone who has low vision, so they can still kind of see the screen. Maybe they have the screen really zoomed in and they're using a screen reader as well. It's going to be very confusing for them if they hear submit, but then on the forefront it reads upload your file. So making sure things are consistent and the same on the front end and back end. Principle 3, understandable. Information and the operation for user interface must be understandable. This principle focuses on ensuring that users understand the content and the elements used to navigate through the web. So guideline 3.1 is readable. And in this principle, we have to make sure that text content is readable and understandable. That's why it's important that you identify the language of a page and let people know what language it is written in. And again, if there are parts of a page that are different, you want to let users know what language that part is written in. So if I wrote my whole document in English and I have one part that's in Spanish, I need to let my users know that that's different. Guideline 3.2, predictable. It's important to make sure that web pages are predictable and that there is consistency across web pages. To do this, make sure any navigation links, like your main navigation menu or secondary navigation menu, are the same, as well as the different elements, like buttons or icons. For example, you wouldn't want to randomly change a button that said next to move forward if it was always saying next on all of your other web pages. Lastly, make sure that random unintended changes, like a pop-up window appearing, do not occur unexpectedly and from users using the interface normally. Guideline 3.3, input assistance. When you have a form, help users to identify and correct mistakes. When doing this, ensure that there are instructions for forms that give information on what is needed to fill out the different sections. Include labels for form elements as well as cues to further enforce this. Lastly, if an error does occur with an online form, make sure that it's identified and a relevant suggestion is provided as to how to fix it. Okay, moving on to Principle 4, robust. Content can be used reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. This principle is getting at the fact that web pages and web content need to be compatible with different technologies and devices, including mobile phones, tablets, PCs, Macs, and assistive technology. Web information needs to work with different tools and update as these tools advance. Guideline 4.1, compatible. When you're done creating a website, you need to check it for errors. So you can either use an automated tool that can help identify common errors within web coding, or you can also check your page manually. And with that, you're going to want to make sure you're looking for proper markup structure and that you didn't make any errors in the way you coded your structure. Okay, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Again, my email is cowled@uwstout.edu, and I'm happy to follow up with anything that you might have comments or questions on. And here are the references that were used today to create this presentation. Thanks for watching.